Good morning. My name is Pratik Murarka, and I'll be a host for the next 2 days for the indie track. We're going to start because, in the interest of time, we have 45 minutes per session. Our first speaker for today is Joel. He's from Method to Madness Studios, and as you know, his topic is called Framing Minimalistic Play. So Joel is a narrative designer at the studio, and before coming into this industry, he was earlier a content writer for about 3 years before he realized that games would be an interesting field for him to work in. He says that games that pique his interest are ones that create stories within blocks of the game world, and video games are by far the best medium to convey evocative stories, and this is why he decided to work in our industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Joel.
Hello everyone, like Pratik said, my name is Joel Zachariah, and I'm the narrative designer for my studio, Method to Madness. I'm actually somewhat new to this industry, and I was a content writer before I teamed up with my brother, who happens to be the lead designer for our studio. Now, my job as a narrative designer has everything to do with the textual and written aspects of the game, and this varies from narrative branching, dialogue structures, and plot progression. What this means is that I focus more on penning down the story, plot, and narrative of the game around its core design and premise, and not the other way around. Together with my brother, our studio was formed nearly 2 years ago, and we've been in the process of developing our first solo project, which is Dear Charlotte. Dear Charlotte is what I like to call a first-person horror experience, and it tells you the story of a madman and his obsession, and how he chooses to cope with the consequences of his actions. The game is still under development. One of our more recent collaborative works is Deathwave. It's a first-person shooter for VR, where players can use a mix of spells and weapons. Our studio did most of the level design for this project, and it's out in Steam Early Access, so you guys should totally check it out. I'm going to start this talk by stating some known facts about video games. Now, the structural definition of a video game is that of a software that is able to control or move pixels on a screen. When you look at games back in the 70s, like Pong or even Space Invaders, you can see how this definition of moving pixels around sounded somewhat apt for what video games were. You had this predetermined goal or objective, and you control objects in the game world to achieve these objectives. That pretty much was, and that pretty much is what video games are. The definition still hasn't changed, but I think we've come a long way from classifying video games just like that, because over time, our industry has only baffled us by showing us how much more they're able to push those perceived limitations. We've actually come a long way from the original Space Invaders, and if there's one thing I think we can all agree with, it's that video games are by far the most immersive and engaging forms of entertainment out there. Now, one of the reasons why we call video games immersive is because it's one of those unique mediums where you feel as if you're present in that game world or environment. And I personally believe that this sense of presence is possible only because you have to physically input an action to correlate what happens on the screen. And this method makes every action or every decision that you do feel a lot more personal. Now, this input or interactivity is essential in separating video games from any other form of entertainment, like books or even movies. And as much as this sets the medium apart, I do believe that it has a fundamental problem, and that's it is biased our perceptions of what video games must be. We are naturally inclined to assume that in order for the video game to function better, it has to be more interactive, or there has to be a lot of events in the game that require physical input. And following this rule has only made us believe that a relation with a player and a game can only be made by these moments and set of mediated interactions. And understanding these perspectives will only make us think that a video game is separate from a player and that it will always stand apart. Personally, I disagree with this. Now, No Man's Sky is a game about exploring desolate planets and harvesting resources from them. There's a lot of things that you can do, but we can't deny there is an inherent experience deep within that game's thick gameplay that we feel while we discover a new planet or while we enter a new solar system, and so on. But here's the problem. The game wouldn't have made its impact if it were purely an experiential game, or if the game was only about that feeling of being and traveling in that ever-expanding universe. The fact is, people bought it for what all you could do in the game. We could, for the sake of argument, say that this experience was some sort of a byproduct and people were actually looking forward for it, but that clearly wasn't the case. Now, this is a basic loop on how interactivity is linked between a player and a game. So what happens here is you input an action on the controller or the keyboard and thereby control what happens on your screen. And this loop keeps repeating. Now, what we tend to do in our industry is we draw a line right in the middle of that loop and design games around that core concept of this interaction being limited to just your physical input. Now, what I'm trying to say is the more interactive or these arbitrary moments of interaction shouldn't necessarily make a game better. As much as this physical input is essential, it shouldn't be considered as the only way interaction can happen with a player. We all know how the limits of video games are being broken every day. And with this medium being one of those most immersive ones, I feel you have an opportunity right there to create more of a personal relation with the player. When you have a unique medium that is capable of extending beyond its physical boundaries to directly establish a link with the player, why do we tend to draw the line in the middle? Why not go further? Why not focus on making games where majority of this interaction happens within the player in the form of an experience? This is a scene from a game called Colat. It's a horror game, and this is where the game starts. You're not told much about what's happening, just a very brief intro, but what I like about this particular segment is how the developers have explained all what you need to do throughout the entire game with just what happens in this particular segment. Now, what happens here is, as you approach that pit in the center of that formation, you find this note. You also hear its voice gushing against the wind. And when you pick up this note, the ground below you lights up, the pillars rises up, and there's some sort of whirlwind around you, and you have about 5 seconds overall to act. If you choose to stay, you obviously die, but if you choose to leave, you see these illusions and you follow it, but the outcome really isn't my point. What I believe the purpose of this moment was, it was the developer's way of telling the player that nothing is as what it seems in the entire game. I know it's a horror game, and I know my point is pretty obvious, but what sounds like a very simple revelation is actually one of the cornerstones of minimalistic play. Here, every situation in the game requires your closer observation, and this creates a very unique sense of atmosphere that Colat stays true throughout the entire game. Here, events are triggered as you move the character, but the real interaction happens within the player in the form of a lasting experience. The game doesn't tell you what to do. It just presented to you a scenario, and how you reacted to it was solely based on your interpretation of that situation. This is what we refer to as minimalistic play, and I'm here to talk to you about my personal insights or what the science behind games like these are. Further explain it by comparing it with games that have actually made it work, why this type of design works very well with respect to horror, and the obstacles we face while we develop them. Now, the term play is somewhat broad and very ambiguous. There are a lot of definitions for it, so let me just put it into a more clearer picture. The term play is usually defined as a sum total of all that you have to do in a particular play space in order to proceed. And this varies from skill-based actions to even puzzle-solving techniques. But for our approach, we are going to limit it to the sum total of physical input the player makes via a controller or even a keyboard. So in this context, games that are categorized under minimalistic play are those where character actions performed are restricted to just walking or looking around, with very little interactivity in the background. What this means is that the game is both minimalistic in appearance and minimalistic in function. These type of games focuses on a state change that produces a sort of a play-like effect, but it's not a state change that happens on the console. Also, do keep in mind this definition is still a work in progress, bias. These unique experiences are grounded into the game via two types of approaches, which are anticipation and interpretation, which are also the frameworks of minimalistic play. Simply put, it's when majority of what the player has to do happens within himself. It happens in those tiny loops where he's trying to make sense of the world around him. As much as a game is a series of scripted events, by following the game's design, the player is able to create his own narrative. Minimalistic games are all about deeper connections. The events happening in the game focus more on connecting with the player on a more personal level. The first approach that I want to talk to you about is called anticipation. I think the term itself is a bit self-explanatory. Anticipation is all about what happens in those moments of physical interaction with the play space. Or simply put, it's what happens when you're waiting to perform your next move, or it's just the wait. So how does this work? With respect to a scenario with minimal physical input, we are talking about a play space where essentially nothing is happening. So from that context, how is waiting, or even just waiting to know, an effective way of relating with the player? Chess is actually a perfect example to explain this approach. Given that we are so focused on interactivity, what makes turn-based games like chess so much fun? I mean, if you look at people playing chess, most of the time spent playing the game is just basically looking at the pieces. There is absolutely no interaction at all with that game board. So most of the play in such a scenario involves you sitting there and figuring out what your next move is, or what move your opponent is going to make. The fun here in playing chess is not when you're actually moving the pieces. It's those moments when you try to figure out what your next move is. And if you're really good at the game, you could just play the entire thing in your head. This anticipation is something that happens within those small moments of interaction with the physical play space. This is an image from the original Rainbow Six, which came out in 1997. Brian Upton is a designer who's worked on this project since its inception, and Brian has said that when he's seen a lot of people playing it, a lot of interesting things happen in spaces where absolutely nothing ever so seems to be happening. Now, this is a time when the FPS genre had the one-shot, one-kill rules of engagement. So any misstep that you took could potentially lose the mission for you. The designers used to intentionally create these long and empty hallways before important parts of a mission. And Brian says that when players were presented with these spaces, they would stand and they would stop and they would think about how they were going to approach the situation ahead. Or they would try to figure out what lays behind that corner. And the gameplay that emerged from this was really crucial in pinning its gameplay experience. This scenario is a perfect example to show you how anticipation should be used in evoking that certain experience which the game is all about. The above image is from a hostage rescue mission, and these empty play spaces were really crucial in forming that atmosphere of tension, and it was imperative in creating that sense of actually being there. And this made you think twice before approaching a situation. That right there is what I'd like to call a personal relation between the player and the game. You can see the same loop work effectively in a game like Thief as well. Even in the original Thief, you had a major restriction on your health bar. So this made you wait and analyze the situation before approaching it. The loop that arises in Thief is purely in understanding your situation. And this cycle of understanding was crucial as to why a game like Thief was called immersive. Another great example which relates to this approach is this game called Antichamber. While the playstyle is not entirely minimalistic, it does show a few traits of it, mainly knowing how to approach a situation before engaging in it. The game, honestly, at first, it seems like a bunch of random puzzles that the developer just combined into separate levels. But on further playthroughs, you realize that it's actually a closely set net of intricate levels that require you to understand how each puzzles work. Think of it like the original Portal games. You're not supposed to be walking around randomly hoping that you'll come across a solution. The game is all about figuring out how each of these respective spaces work. The next approach is called interpretation. Games that fall under this category are those which require you to understand the underlying premise of the game. There are no definitive objectives in such a scenario. Yes, the game ends when you reach the end point, but the point of such an experience would be to find an interpretation of the game that makes it feel complete. This is a game made by the studio Chinese Room. It's called Dear Esther. Now, Dear Esther is a game that begins without any clear explanation of the current state that the player is in. You have a narrator who begins with the title and message, Dear Esther, and the player is left with the first of many questions. Who is Esther? What is happening around him? What the game does is, it offers you an invitation to find out these answers for themselves. One major thing to note is there is no amount of interactivity present in the game. You can walk, you can look around, you can pick up a very limited number of objects, and yet this game is a very interesting play experience. Like I said, you can walk around, you can look at things, and events get triggered as you move through it, but what the game does is, as long as it continues to provide you interesting situations to explore, we can always enjoy an experience like Dear Esther, even though that interaction is minimum. Everything in the game has been deliberately arranged to funnel the player to an endpoint, while maintaining the illusion of freedom within a larger world. Although many games seek to capture this sort of subtle manipulation, it's especially critical to note in Dear Esther because the player is never directly given a clue as to their destination or how they should even reach there. To understand why a concept like this is interesting, we have to relate this to the player's interpretation. This is a type of game that is directed towards meaning. You're not just asking yourself, what's going around here, but you're asking yourself, what does this mean? Why do I care? What does this say about the world around me? Being able to operate in that cycle when you move from moment to moment is what drives a game like Dear Esther. It's not about solving puzzles or achieving that objective. A craving for answers is the driving factor behind the exploration of the game. It's about finding that interpretation that feels whole and complete as you're moving through the space. In games like these, there is no win state. There isn't a definitive goal to achieve, and there is no obvious success state. It's all about finding that interpretation about the game by yourself. There is satisfaction, but it is not through winning in the game world. Another great example to explain this approach is this game called PT, or Playable Teaser. It was a demo that was developed by Hideo Kojima. It's a horror game, and basically the game consists of this L-shaped hallway that changes itself constantly as you keep entering and exiting it. Just like the case of Dear Esther, there is the thinnest amount of interactivity present in the game. Apart from walking, looking, and zooming in on certain objects, there is nothing else you can do in this game. Because of the limited interaction and repetition of levels, feedback cues in the games were very confusing, and nobody actually understood what was happening. And although it may sound like a bad thing, what this amounted to was, it amounted to hours of interpretive play out of this simple non-interactive space. When the game starts out, the hallway is well lit. You can see what's happening. You can even see around the corners as well. And with each re-entry, this hallway starts to gradually turn into a more nightmarish version, and people start appearing like this. I know it's a classic example of what you call a jump scare, but there is a science behind why this works. How a non-interactive and minimalistic space makes this sort of an impact on us. The reasons are environmental cues that drive anticipation, repetition of levels that makes us concentrate attention on difference, a deep stillness throughout the game which gives you ample time to ponder on the evidence. Because of the lack of objects or things to look at, almost everything in the space seems very significant. And because the level keeps repeating itself, there is a hard stillness that exists where you're driven to look at various things within the space and try to consider what it means. Why should I be looking at it? Why am I even being placed in a situation like this? It's very important to emphasize this because almost nothing ever happens in the game, and this is where your interpretation of the scene takes effect. And this is why it works as a horror experience. There's also this pervasive atmosphere of insanity that you gradually start to pick up on as you keep playing it. For example, the photo of a married couple beside those empty pill bottles and cigarette butts, may suggest a backstory that has something to do with an abusive relationship. There's also this message that pops up on this wall after a couple of playthroughs, and it reads something like, "I can hear them calling me from hell." Now, if this were an action-oriented game, you would just blaze right past through it, and even if you read it, it wouldn't make such an impact. But because there is nothing else to look at, the emergence of this message seems very significant. No matter how you play this, all the solutions lead to the feeling of dread, with absolutely no interactivity and just walking around. This game was able to completely immerse you in its psychotic world, and you felt every span of it. With minimal physical input, the games mentioned above were able to create a more personal and deeper relation with the player. The absence of a backstory or any other sort of clues helped increase that sense of mystery and pushed each player to further understand the meaning behind each of these worlds. Here, ultimately, the narrative becomes the one that the player interpreted, which enhances that personal bond between the game and the player. This self-revelation is what resonates with the player, making the story his own interpretation and thus making the experience last. This is actually a really crucial point. Just because nothing happens in a space, it doesn't automatically become interesting. Anticipatory and interpretive approaches must be used to create interesting situations that demand and call for player attention. Walking around randomly or looking at irrelevant objects doesn't make a play space worth playing. Minimalism has to be grounded on the idea that player must feel as if he is in control of the character. This is why we restrict those character actions to just walking and looking around, to make sure he understands that he is a part of the world around him and it's as alive as he is. Now let me share with you why we chose this design approach. And in order to further explain that, I'm going to have to talk to you about the inception of our idea and a few stages of its transition. Now, around 4 years ago, my brother had this idea for this game where you as the player, you fight your way through your objectives by creating portals across platforms. Yes, it was, think of it like the original Portal games, but instead of relying heavily on puzzles, this game laid a much more heavier emphasis on platformer and combat elements. So basically, you had to jump from floors, create portals, take down enemies using guns. There were a lot of cool stuffs you could do in that time frame where you exited the portal, from slowing down time, using grappling hooks to get closer to enemies. It was a very fun experience, but ultimately he wasn't satisfied with it. See, what he wanted to do throughout the game was to tell a story about a person who wanted to reunite with his other half. That was the basic idea. A person trying to get to the other side of this world to reclaim his former self. What we eventually realized with this prototype was that with all these gameplay elements combined into the space, the player would only think about the technique or method to get to the endpoint. Even with the narrative being played in the background, the game would never be about the character's mental journey. All the gameplay elements combined to form what we call a fun experience, but even this experience was constricted to the need of achieving that end objective, and the fun was limited to the time the player achieved his goal, and the game slowly got overshadowed by it. Thomas Grip, the creative director at Frictional Games, has a term for a design like this. It's called a black box design. Imagine it like this. At the core of the design of a game is a black box, a system unknown to the player. The goal is to intuitively figure out and master the box by interacting with the game's mechanics. I know it sounds very tricky, but it's actually extremely simple. For example, a better knowledge of the weapons you use in Counter-Strike gives you an upper hand against your opponents. The better the player is at predicting and using the rules that are in the black box, the better the player is at the game. The problem with such an approach is that it works very well if your game demands a particular skill set. But what I mean is that making a game too much dependent on its mechanics broke our idea of an immersive experience. Or it rather pushed the player away from the experience we wanted him to feel. The idea was to use interaction to create that sense of presence, or as a form of self-expression. It was supposed to enact a change in the world just by the player's presence. But it ultimately turned out to be more of what we like to call an engaging experience and not an immersive one. Now, being immersed in a video game is a very broad term. You hear it a lot these days, but you need to understand there is a big difference between solely being immersed in a game and solely being engaged in one. Engagement always relies on the number of things you can do in the world or how interactive it is. You're always constantly doing something in such a scenario. Engagement is always about being absorbed by the game's challenges. What I personally feel is that a player can't be immersed in a game if he only thinks about that reward or end game. Let's be honest, we are never really immersed while we are playing Candy Crush. That's not how I believe immersion works. Immersion is not just the ability to make the player forget his reality, it must also teleport the player into the made-up one in the video game. Objectives in this scenario are just an illusion to make you feel like there's something at the end, but it's not the thread that holds the game together. Proper immersion makes the player believe in the world around him. Books and movies does this pretty well. I mean, you're clearly not immersed in a book or a movie if you just wait to see how it ends. Everything I've talked about essentially comes down to the point of creating interesting situations. Anticipation, interpretation must be used to create a system that generates these interesting situations. Immersion and engagement, from my points, may sound like they're complete opposites, but they are opposites on the same coin. An equal balance from both is required to effectively maintain that sense of presence. But there is another concept that comes into play when all of this is done perfectly. This concept is called mental modeling. And I do believe it is another factor that enhances immersion in a video game. I believe it's a sort of an elemental ability that we humans possess. And that's humans are natural storytellers. We possess the capability of framing scenarios from just abstract information. This is actually really profound. Think of it like this. When you're walking up a steep hill, you don't know what's on the other side. And your mind slowly, gradually fills it with images of what it could look like. You're never really certain about it until you see it firsthand. And video games are by far the best medium to create this feedback loop structure. When you present the player in a play space and make him play the story and not just passively observe it, he will form his own interpretations from it. This is why I believe minimalism is so effective in video games, and it is also how you create that sense of presence. Using these feedback loops effectively helps the player relate to the experience firsthand because it will always be his interpretation, a narrative that he pieced together, and that will always leave a lasting impression in the player. Now, from personal experiences and seeing a lot of people playing, I do believe horror is by far the most effective and comparatively easier genres to benefit from this minimalistic approach. Now, horror itself is a very broad category of fiction. You have a lot of subgenres, and it constantly changes itself in the way it's being represented. Any work or word that produces the feeling of fear, dread, shock, and disgust can be categorized as horror. You don't need a lot of explaining to do when you tell someone your work falls under horror. The general idea is clearly given by that representation, and that's why I believe the genre is unique, because it is also able to describe the emotion being produced. It is actually the horror genre that brought the idea of using minimalism in video games. I mean, even in movies, the most intense or frightening parts are usually preceded by moments where nothing ever seems to be happening. And these are moments of intense anticipation. In video games, this minimalism is achieved by prolonging these moments of anticipation and leaving the player in a world that demands attention to its surroundings and leaving the player with not much thought apart from evading his personal fear. Achieving this in movies is a bit tricky, but it's comparatively really easier to do it in video games. Using these very limited gameplay mechanics, what we do with the horror genre is we utilize its inherent strengths. Horror is a medium, and one of those very rare mediums where we continue to enjoy an experience even though it frightens us. Even though we know we wouldn't want to sit through that experience twice, it still is an irresistible genre in video games. If a horror game does these two jobs perfectly, it's something that I like to call a true horror experience. And what this does is, firstly, it immerses us in an atmosphere of dread. The essence of that statement is not just simply immersing a player in a situation of fear or anticipation. It has to go more than that. This situation must make players feel disempowered to the obstacles ahead, and this must be a driving force as to why he feels afraid of the situation that he's in. True horror must always explore our fears and dig deeper into the roots of what we fear. We all are afraid of something. Afraid of the dark, afraid of heights. It's a very common thing. I do believe a true horror experience must go beyond our fundamental weaknesses and introduce a whole new side of it that we never thought would exist or even be afraid of. It must bring to the table an area of uncertainty of what we could expect from situations ahead. From that context, horror games must always be able to violate our comfort zones. This is another reason why I believe the emphasis on any other survival mechanic is something that breaks the immersion in a true horror experience. The game must make the player feel vulnerable and prone to the situations that he has never been in before. Finally, it must allow us to vigorously experience the thrill of being preyed upon. Now, Brian Gomez said this quote, and he was one of the directors behind the team that made Silent Hill: The Shattered Memories. The title wasn't a commercial success, but that point is actually something that's very true. Why do we play horror games? The thought that we're being watched or the thought that we're being preyed upon is something that I believe is very subtle, but it exists. For some people, it's an adrenaline rush, but for others, it's extremely frightening. But even in both these cases, the experience is vital and it's never neglected. Now, Slender is a game that utilizes all these concepts perfectly. Just like the scenario from PT, you don't do much apart from walking around and collecting these 8 random notes and avoiding this monster called Slenderman. But since the entire environment consists mostly of the same trees spreading out, every frame in the game demands your attention, and you will always be in the lookout for something out of the ordinary. When your primary goal in a game is to survive, not by managing resources, but by evading danger, you feel your surroundings become a lot more ambiguous and you never really know what's behind a particular corner. And Slender utilizes this concept to show you a concrete message that true horror is not a complicated emotion, but it is the most powerful and effective ones to create a lasting experience. Now, I want to conclude this presentation by entering the last segment, which are the risks and obstacles we naturally come across with games like these. Now, no design is without its own sets of risks and challenges. And the points I cover here don't just stick plainly with experiential games. Looking back at all the points I've spoken about, it may seem that a biggest hurdle that we have to cross would be some sort of a design flaw that may hinder player experience. But from a developer standpoint, I do believe it's the most basic reasons that are in itself a feat of its own. Now, our market consists of genres that have increased in numbers over the years. And we are even in a state where effective hybrids of these respective genres work very well in the market. We can also say that the way each of these genres can work well in our market is only through years of innovation and iteration. None of the active participants in any of these genres were viral with the first product. It took a considerable amount of time to make these genres accepted within the audience. In each of these cases, there were a clear set of features that communicated with the player and made his decision easier in selecting any of these titles. Now, minimalistic design that essentially thrives on its experiential play isn't something that I believe you can advertise in a box. On a very rudimentary level, we could associate it with a non-genre, but classifying it solely based on what that genre represents wouldn't be doing justice to the game. This makes penetration into an established market very hard, because not only is the genre unknown, it has not yet been accepted by the audience as well. Ultimately, as developers, we do this for the love of the medium. We like having fun, but more than that, we enjoy other people having fun from what we create. I've always felt that there's a major difference between making money out of this and doing this for a living. And frankly, that's what that red circle stands for. Projects like these are mostly fueled by passion, and as much as that passion is needed, we need to accept the fact that what we are ultimately making is a product, and we need to sell that. Sustainability is always going to be a long stretch for us. Two acknowledgements that I'd like to make are, one is Brian Upton of Sony Santa Monica Studios. He's actually written a book on how you can further design these experiential play spaces using very compact and concise heuristics. The book is called The Aesthetics of Play. Another is Thomas Grip of Frictional Games for coming up with the concept of mental modeling and how it can be further used to effectively bring out a narrative structure in game design. I highly recommend you checking out all his talks that he's done at GDC. I hope the talk was informative, and I know a lot of things are debatable. So if you do have any questions, do feel free to send me a mail. That's my email ID, joel.zack@methodtomadness.in. Thank you.